Hi, I'm Zach with MakeUseOf.com and you're watching another product review. This week we're taking a look at the FlashForge Artemis 3D printer. The Artemis is the latest model of 3D printer from developer FlashForge, who are famous for their Adventurer and Creator series of 3D printers. And they're now touting the Artemis as, quote, your next warrior and workhorse desktop 3D printer, and saying that it's good for a home tinkerer, student, teacher, beginner, or expert in 3D printing. So this review has me very excited. 3D printing is such a fascinating and relatively new technology. It intersects with so many other hobbies and professions. It really just seems like there are limitless possibilities for its application. Personally, I like tabletop gaming and board games a lot. 3D printing has a lot of obvious applications to that hobby in particular, but I was still hesitant to get into it, as I'm sure many of you might be now or have been at some point, because 3D printing just sounds intimidating. These are really complicated pieces of machinery with lots of moving parts, and even though it's getting more and more affordable each year, you're still at the very least gonna need to know the basics of a slicer software. I would not consider myself much of a home tinkerer, and I haven't been a student for several years either, so up until about 6 weeks ago when I got the Artemis, beginner was the only category I really fell into. And as you can see now, still probably still a beginner. Just fell apart. This part coming apart is technically not my fault. These pieces aren't clicking together right. But as you can see, some of these other seams didn't come together quite as well, and there's actually quite a bit of stringing going on inside of the hilt of the sword. But that's okay, because overall I think this thing looks so cool. I mean, look how shiny it is. It's like a 1-to-1 scale. Zelda fans, hello? But the issues I had with this print and some of the other ones have all been a part of my ongoing learning process, which is what I'm gonna be showing off in the rest of this video, my learning process as a beginner up until where I'm at now with Master Sword. I think FlashForge has positioned the Artemis in a few really interesting ways that may or may not fulfill its mission of being an ideal 3D printer for beginners and veterans alike. It's compatible with software like Polar Cloud 3D, which seems to be at least in part a tool for educators, but the Artemis is also a bit outside of the beginner price range at $585. So whether you are a beginner like myself or an expert in 3D printing, stick around to the end of the video. I'm gonna be going over all of my ups and downs with the FlashForge Artemis. I'm gonna go over the best and worst results I got from prints, maintenance of the printer, compatible softwares, and everything else in between. The FlashForge Artemis starts out with what I consider to be a huge pro. It comes fully assembled out of the box. There are still quite a few things we'll have to do before we can start our first print, but I definitely think of this as a huge win over some of the other cheaper 3D printers marketed towards beginners. Not having to assemble the printer itself suddenly makes this entire process feel so much more manageable. In the package is the Artemis, all wrapped up in styrofoam, and inside of the Artemis you will find a power cable, a filament spool rack that attaches to the back of the printer, both a glass sheet and a flexible spring sheet for the printer bed, several small tools like wrenches, screwdrivers, a scraper tool, a needle, a glue stick, a few replacement parts, and most importantly, a USB flash disk loaded with FlashForge's very own slicer software, FlashPrint. And not to mention the very generous inclusion of not one, but 2 spools of filament, one black and one white. Once you've unpacked all of the components, there are several zip ties on the inside of the Artemis that you'll have to cut out. Most of these are easy to find or clearly labeled, but there were a few that I almost missed. What's worse is that there are actually still a few more really tiny zip ties around some of the power cables on the extruder head, and cutting zip ties around belts and stuff when you're not really sure what any of this does is stressful enough. Having to guess just makes it even worse. So now the user guide just has 2 remaining steps before we can get started with the slicer software and our first print. And those are loading filament into the printer and leveling the printer bed. Now, if you had to just guess which of those 2 tasks, loading filament into the printer or leveling the bed, which would you assume is the more difficult task? Because I was very surprised at just how easy it was to level this, and also how much trouble loading filament gave me. And loading filament into the printer actually is very easy. If anything, it's more just a testament as to how simple it is to level the printer bed with the Artemis. So much so that I actually re-leveled and recalibrated it a couple times just to be sure that I was right, because I didn't think that it could have been that easy. But basically, the on-screen prompts that guide you through the leveling process make it really easy. I nailed it on my first try. And loading filament is really easy. It's just a spool on the back of the printer that comes up through this tube and into the extruder head. And the only reason it wasn't working for me is because I wasn't pushing it in far enough through the tube. That's maybe one of the only drawbacks of not having to assemble the printer yourself, is I didn't really know what the inside of the extruder looked like and how far I needed to push the filament, but it's easy. Now, the only thing standing between you and your first print on the FlashForge Artemis is opening that slicer software and getting that sweet, sweet G-code. And this was another very pleasant surprise the first time I opened up FlashPrint. I think part of the reason I wasn't looking forward to learning a slicer software is because every glimpse I've caught of them up until that point have always looked so ugly to me. The interface of FlashPrint, on the other hand, is much more aesthetically pleasing. It actually makes printing things so easy that I didn't even really start digging into how the software worked until I'd completed a few prints. The 2 test prints that came preloaded on the flash disk, however, did leave me a little disappointed. I mean, what even are these things? Where is my benchy FlashForge? In all seriousness though, I really don't think that the test files that come preloaded on this are very good test prints. I think test prints should be exactly that. They're a test to see how accurate your printer is, and it's likely gonna be the very first thing that you make on your 3D printer. So I loaded up the filter connector. What is this thing even called? That I saw was supposed to take like 6 hours to print it. 6 hours for a test print. So I brought it back in the slicer, knocked it down to 25% scale and printed it in 45 minutes. I'll talk a little bit more about FlashPrint and the other slicer softwares in a little bit, but first, let's cover the hardware of the Artemis. I think that the Artemis is one of the coolest, if not the coolest looking 3D printer available, especially when you compare it to the other beginner level 3D printers in the $200 to $400 range. Having a partially enclosed build plate and a mostly concealed filament rack go a long way for the Artemis's appearance. When I see 3D printers that don't have any sort of enclosure or have 1 or 2 spools of filament sticking out of the top of it, I feel like it belongs on a workbench in a garage or a basement somewhere. The Artemis, on the other hand, I think fits perfectly in my home office next to my 2D printer. And that thing has worked like 1 time ever. So by comparison, the Artemis is doing great. And it prints things in a whole extra dimension, so. The Artemis has a 4.3-inch full-color touchscreen display, and the interface is super user-friendly. Like I mentioned, it made the process of leveling the bed really easy. I never felt lost or like I couldn't find anything that I was looking for. I also greatly appreciated the inclusion of the flexible spring sheet bed. I installed this thing right away, never even tried using the glass sheet, and now I can't really understand why anyone would want to use a glass sheet instead of one of these flexible spring ones. I've had very few issues with adhesion, and the only minor ones that I did experience didn't even ruin the prints. Never had to use the glue stick or the scraper, and honestly, I've barely even had to flex the spring sheet. Most times, once the bed cools, the prints will just fall right off. I think the build plate itself has a volume that is pretty average by most standards. It's 190 millimeters long by 195 millimeters wide and 200 millimeters tall. So obviously this thing can handle printing smaller stuff like minifigures or terrain for Dungeons and Dragons and wargaming, but it's also able to print pretty big stuff like the Master Sword I showed off at the beginning of the video. So even if you want to print something huge like an Iron Man suit or whatever, a print bed this size can get you there. It's just a matter of how many chunks are you going to be making this big print in. I was able to print most of the same colors at the same time for the Master Sword. All the blade pieces I had stacked vertically and they came out at once. All the little gold embellishments came out at once. The only thing that I couldn't fit in one go were the 2 halves of the hilt. They were just a little bit too wide with the way that I had to like lay them flat on the bed. But the bed has a pretty decent sized volume. Besides the sword, the next biggest thing I printed was this wicked looking skull. It is actually a dice tower, like so. It's a 10. This took about 36 hours to print. And there is a crazy amount of detail on this skull. I was really impressed with how this came out, especially for being like my 3rd or 4th print ever and being a completely free STL file. This is what I was talking about when I was saying before I really learned how to use the slicer software. I basically just drag and drop this file, put it into the printer, and had this skull a day and a half later. Last few things I will say about the hardware on the Artemis. The printing process itself is pretty quiet. In my very limited experience with 3D printers prior to owning one, I'd say that the Artemis is the quietest printer I have heard, but it's not completely silent. You'll mostly just hear the fan running with the occasional whirs of motors and servos. My home office that I keep the Artemis in is within clear earshot of the living room, and it hasn't disturbed any TV watching or naps on the couch or anything thus far. I will say though that I do live in a pretty big city near busy streets and an airport and all that jazz, so I'm pretty used to background noise and stuff like that, but the Artemis's noise level never bothered me. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but the filament rack that feeds the filament into the printer is mostly concealed. It's just on the back of the printer rather than being on top of it. It's not concealed in like a compartment or behind a door or anything like that, but I think having the filament rack behind the printer rather than on top of it makes the overall space that the Artemis occupies look a lot cleaner and less chaotic. Finally, the extruder can heat up to 260 degrees Celsius. I haven't had to heat mine past like 245, and I'm still novice enough to not really know why you'd ever want to get it much hotter than that, but it's good to know that I haven't had to reach that ceiling yet, I guess. FlashForge's own slicer software, FlashPrint, comes preloaded onto the flash drive. However, the Artemis is compatible with third-party slicing softwares. So I tried to install and learn Cura because from what I can tell, it seems to be one of the more popular options available and it might be easier to learn that way. Unfortunately, even though FlashForge is compatible with Cura, the Artemis wasn't an available model of 3D printers available yet. So if you've been 3D printing a long time and you want to stick with Cura, FlashForge is compatible with that, and I'm assuming by the time this video goes up, the Artemis will be an available model that you can select in Cura. But at the time of filming, that was not an option for me. So I bounced back to FlashPrint. I was more comfortable with that anyway. It was my first exposure to a slicer software, and like I said, it is very user-friendly. So for new users like myself, I would definitely recommend FlashPrint. And even if you are an expert in 3D printing, I think the user interface alone really makes it worth checking out. Another third-party software that the Artemis is compatible with that I mentioned earlier in the video is Polar Cloud 3D. I didn't spend a ton of time on Polar Cloud, but from what I can tell, it seems to be a site similar to Thingiverse, but geared more towards educational content. And I wanted to try printing something from them. So let's just look around here real quick. And, oh, yep, that'll do it. I'm still so impressed by the Rocktopus. There's so much detail in his face, you know exactly who it is. And the tentacles, all the little articulating joints. This all came out in one go. It's mind-blowing to me. A single free STL file, Polar Cloud 3D, the Rocktopus. Last thing I will talk about in this section that isn't really software but fits better in this part of the video than anywhere else is the fact that the Artemis can connect to Wi-Fi. And this is a great feature when it works, but I haven't gotten the Artemis to connect super consistently. In FlashPrint, after slicing your model, simply click print rather than download, and you'll be given the option to connect your printer via IP address. The first time I did this, my computer connected immediately, and as soon as the connection is made between your computer and the Artemis, the print starts. But after the first time I did it successfully, I've had about a 50-50 success rate on whether or not my printer can connect to my computer. And on one occasion where it did connect, and I think maybe just because the file size was really big, it spent a really long time loading the file onto the printer. So I just canceled the upload and did it the old-fashioned way. Sometimes just restarting my computer was enough to get the connection to be successful. But after a certain point, I don't really mind running up a flight of stairs with a flash drive to get a print started. So on to my actual experience printing. As you can see, I think I've had some pretty impressive results. I'm consistently shocked by the fact that you can print out articulated joints in a single go, like with the Rocktopus's tentacles, or with this fidget cube I made. This thing is actually insanely addicting, and I need to put it far away from me or I'm gonna play with it for the rest of this video. Both of these prints, as well as the majority of my most impressive prints, all came on the standard black and white PLA that came with the Artemis. I'm really impressed by the accuracy and fidelity achieved by this filament, considering that it came free with the printer. I only purchased filament separately on one occasion, and it's all the shiny colors I got, so the silver, the blue, the gold. And these smaller silk spools I'm not quite as much of a fan of. The Ocarina of Time, I think, is a pretty good example. I used some supports on it that didn't break off quite as cleanly as they do with the black and white stuff. There's a little bit of stringing on the inside of these holes, and just overall, if we get up close on these textures, as you can see, a few of the lines have more pronounced gaps in them. I think these 5 prints in particular are a good example of my progress. These are custom minifigures of a character that I'm currently playing in a D&D campaign, and this is the only STL file I paid money for. It was $8 to get this little guy. And I kind of assumed that printing him would give me no problem at all, since at that point I had already completed the highly detailed skull and models with moving joints. Here's version 1 and 2. Both of these didn't get very far because I didn't add any supports to them, so they basically just started stringing and falling apart. I had tried adjusting his size, but that wasn't really the problem. By version 3, you can see that I'm actually getting the shape of a character to come out, but there's so much stringing that you can basically make out no detail whatsoever. By version 4, he's a bit more recognizable, but part of his staff broke off and his arm cracked while I was trying to remove supports. It was at this point that I started to wish FlashForge would have included some tweezers or maybe needle nose pliers instead of a glue stick or some of the other stuff that I haven't used. Might have been a little more useful, but perhaps not for everyone. By version 5, you can see that my mini still isn't perfect, and I'll probably even try making another version of him at some point, but I'm much happier with this one compared to version 1. Seeing him evolve through my learning process has been very encouraging. But I will probably invest in a resin 3D printer before I invest in more minifigure STL files. As a further testament to the Artemis's quality, I really haven't had that many prints outright fail. And messing around with the different settings between different iterations of my minifigure were where most of my failed prints came from. I really didn't have that many failed prints to speak of, and so I even tried out this stringing test thinking that maybe that would help me figure out what was wrong with the minifigure prints. You can see right out of the print bed that the string test had almost no strings on it. The few that were there were really easy to clean up. This to me seems to indicate that the less impressive results I got, like with the ocarina or parts of the Master Sword, are more than likely coming from me not properly dialing in settings for the silk color filament. However, my worst failed print is probably a pretty serious mark against the FlashForge Artemis. On their site, FlashForge lists the Artemis as having a filament out detection system, so that theoretically, if any of your prints, you run out of filament partway through the process, it will pause. As you can see here, I was trying to print a full bed of scatter terrain and I ran out of filament. I don't know how long the printer was running on empty, but at least a couple hours given the distance between the nozzle and the model. That was my first and only experience of running out of filament on a print, and while the auto stop detection system that failed to go off wouldn't have saved that print anyway, it still seems like a pretty serious mark against the Artemis. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the maintenance that the Artemis requires and give a quick shout out to the US FlashForge support team. I only had 2 major issues come up where I didn't know what was wrong, couldn't fix it or find answers or help online, so I contacted FlashForge support, and in both cases, they were extremely helpful, quick to respond, and I got my issues resolved no problem. The first of these 2 issues came pretty shortly after setup. The Y-axis seemed to not have a full range of motion and would start clicking when it was trying to move. Support suggested there might be some sort of misalignment and suggested I just try to adjust the Y-axis manually. And I'm still not sure what, but something clicked into place, and since then it's been running just fine. And my second issue only arose about a week ago, right when I was getting ready to film this video. Nothing was coming out of the extruder and I didn't know what the problem was, so again, reached out to FlashForge. And after troubleshooting for a while with support, we figured out that I needed to replace a nozzle. A quick Google search suggests that I should only have to replace a nozzle every 3 to 6 months, and I've only had my Artemis for 6 weeks. But to be fair, I've been running it pretty much constantly since I've had it. Replacing the nozzle was definitely a bit more in-depth in terms of maintenance that I felt comfortable with. But in hindsight, it's really not that difficult to do, and the extra nozzles included in the package had me feeling much more prepared to do it on my own next time. As someone new to 3D printing, I'm extremely glad that my first experience with the hobby was with a printer like this one. The color touchscreen display and FlashPrint software makes controlling the printer really easy and the learning process feel approachable. The modern look of the Artemis and the lack of assembly required also make it really easy to love. So, would I recommend the FlashForge Artemis to someone who is new to 3D printing? If you're willing to spend a little bit more, then the answer is absolutely yes. Most people looking at their very first 3D printer are probably going to be weighing options that are a lot cheaper than the Artemis. This printer is almost 600 bucks, and for a hobby that can be as intimidating as 3D printing to get started with, I think it's pretty understandable that you're gonna be wanting to looking at cheaper options first. However, FlashForge and FlashPrint in particular go a long way to help your first experience with 3D printing and the Artemis feel simple. And for those of you with a bit more experience 3D printing, I would still definitely recommend checking out the FlashForge Artemis. For a mid-range printer in terms of size and price, you can get some really impressive results with the Artemis, and it looks great. Hopefully my experience and print results can give you some valuable insight into whether or not the Artemis is right for you, and I definitely look forward to reading some of your helpful advice in the comments below. Thank you for watching this tech product review with makeuseof.com. If you found this video to be helpful, we'd appreciate it if you leave a like or a comment below, and maybe consider subscribing if you want to see more tech product reviews like this in the future. Make Use Of posts new videos every single week. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.